You're listening to Edge Radio TV. The views and opinions expressed in this program are that of the hosts or guests, and not the Edge Radio Network or its advertisers or affiliates.
E.R.A.S.E is an organization. It's a movement. We're talking about unity. We're talking about unity. So we're aimed to taking down the system of race by educating, enlightening, informing, and positively debating with those who have counterviews.
Welcome to Edge Radio's Talk About Unity. I'm Richard, and today's show is entitled The Language That Divides Us.
I'm Carlin Charleston. I'm the director of E.R.A.S.E. And I tell you what, we're ready for our show today, The Language That Divides Us, because there's a lot of language out there that's been dividing us. And I want to welcome you to our show today, and we're going to get to our main topic, the language that divides us. But first thing we want to do is we want to talk about some of the hectic stuff that's happening out there in the world. All right. We got the last week and a half. Now people say last 2 weeks. It's just been crazy. We got the Chauvin trial, the verdict from that thing and the fallout from that, both good and bad. We got the Bryant shooting, which happened in Ohio. We got Adam Toledo shooting in Chicago. It's all about shootings. And now we're bracing for the release of the video in Elizabeth City, North Carolina.
Oh, my.
And ahead of that, they declared a state of emergency Monday. And they believe that it's going to cause a lot of civil unrest. And so that's all the kind of stuff. So we're going to talk about all that stuff that's happened. Hey, and in today's show, The Language Divides Us, and we're going to bring our guest in a second. Because we're excited to have what I call our resident deconstructionist, race deconstructionist, George Milton. We'll get to that. But also, if we have time, and like I said, when I got George on here, I just have a big window open because I never know how much stuff we're going to be able to squeeze in there. But we had this letter that a police officer in Los Angeles wrote to LeBron James. And it's pretty interesting. Maybe we'll get to it. Maybe we won't. So we'll see. So, all right. So, George, let's bring George in. This is George Middleton. Come on in, George. What do you say?
Hey. I'm out here on E.R.A.S.E, talk about unity with a couple of the prettiest guys in the business.
We never call that pretty. We're pretty, All right, so good. We're good to go.
Man, I'll tell you what, George, we've had you on before, and tell our listeners today why you are referred to as a race deconstructionist.
It's a kind of a hodgepodge. Is kind of self-titled. I led myself into it when I met Carlin, and Carlin kind of put those words together, and I said, that sounds about right. So I think I'll roll with that.
Keep that.
But the primary philosophy of it is that race is a social construct, and using the term deconstruction is more effective for me than saying anti-race or fight against race or, eradicate race, because that sets up a psychological dilemma, and that you are validating the very thing that you're trying to release yourself from. So it might be a difference of nuance, because anti-racism is a popular term used, but I don't think it's a very effective one. The words are powerful, and where you put your focus is where the energy is going to go. So deconstruction is different because it takes the resistance out of it. It's about how you think, and a matter of just addressing your own belief system and the way you think. When you address what's going on in your head, whatever's going on the outside of you has less impact, because it matters more how you're thinking.
That's good.
Now, George, you see, and you're the perfect guest for us on a show today. And since we had you on last week, I hate bringing you back every week because they're going to think this is the George Middleton show, But I tell you what, you're the perfect person to have, because your background as a cognitive behavioral therapist, because a lot of this stuff that we're talking about is so, I guess you'd say, psychological, and it's got that that cognitive factor in it when we start talking about these terms that are being used to further some of these concepts. So that's the kind of stuff that we're going to talk about. So, but I'm going to set the stage for that, and we're going to go to this. I'm going to display this graphic timeline, and we're going to talk about that because I want to kind of talk about how we got here and why we're talking the way that we are right now. And so if on that timeline, as you look up here, everybody kind of understands this history that we've got of our country, all right? And we had this period of slavery. We've got the segregation, the Jim Crow law, the Jim Crow era, and all of that. Then we had, of course, the Civil Rights era, which isn't displayed here, but we know that period that existed. And then post that, then we started talking about, this period of mass incarceration. The reason that we're talking about the terms and the language that divides us is because of what I think, and this is really simply my theory, and George, I definitely want to hear your view on this, but we were, in the Civil Rights era, and I would say even in the 70s, then there was a lot of stuff. I was talking with a friend about the Blazing Saddles movie and the stuff that they said in that movie which would just set people off so bad today, it would be amazing. But in that, then people understood what our issues were with stereotypes about people of different skin colors and things like that. And so it was really a big joke in a lot of the movies that were made in the 70s and things like that. And so I think we were on an upward trajectory in the United States of understanding that we had these issues from our history, both slavery, Jim Crow, civil rights, and we were doing things to try to affect change in those areas. And so we were working towards that. And I think we were moving forward. Something happened in 1990 with this, and actually 1989 when they invented critical race theory, and that came, of course, out of Harvard. And there began to be a different change in wording and terminology and some of the things that we'll talk about today. And that was the introduction of critical race theory. And critical race theory was this idea then that all the stuff that we were trying to do, that Dr. King's civil rights and was trying to make this change, kind of put a different spin on it. Instead of Dr. King saying that we need to make America live up to its founding documents, critical race theory said, all of your founding is wrong. All of your founding was based on something else. And so the wording then began to support a narrative that says, no, that's not the plan. And if Dr. King's plan had worked, we would be in a better place. And so we've got now, I think, a different philosophy, which is why so many people today are saying it's worse than it's ever been. Well, how could that be? Because I think we hit a reset button in 1990 with critical race theory, and we started introducing terminologies and concepts that said what we were trying to do to fix the problem wasn't working. And I kind of disagree with that, and we're going to talk about that. So what do you think about that, George? That's Carter's theory, the erase race guy. That's a theory that I've got. What would you think about that, George?
Well, you and I, we're definitely in agreement on the fact that anything that is framed inside the race paradigm, ultimately, no matter what the intent is, because there are a lot of well-intended initiatives trying to address race. But as long as the thinking is framed in race and the terminology is framed in race, then your outcome is going to be a racial outcome. Right. And racial outcomes are inherently divisive. No matter what the intent is, it's inherently divisive because it's perceived based on the color line. So if this was intended to address a Black situation, then there's going to be a divisive response from the white side of the coin, and vice versa. So even with critical race theory, well-intended, trying to understand the ideology, which, to keep it simple, race ideology is just lunacy, but it's integrated in every aspect of our systemic existence, that it is given an air of credibility that it should not be given. So even calling it critical race theory, for me personally, while I respect the work that was put into it, I wouldn't want to give race that kind of credibility, to give it a critical race theory, because it was intended for really diabolical and psychologically manipulative and exploitative purposes.
And when you make that statement and you say that, because I think, and I always ask Vince, because Vince is our resident young guy, I was like, how do you think society is going to receive that right now? Now, I think we might be in a little better place because of some of the bad stuff that's happened, but how is society able to receive that idea that any race terminology, any race jargon, any race ideology is a bad thing and has to be done away with. Because that's what I talk about in race racing.
Yeah.
That's where we come. So how is society, will society receive that today?
Well, I would never say bad. Right. Because once you do that, whoever believes in it is automatically feeling like, well, you're judging me. So I don't say bad. I'm just talking about the ideology. The ideology is not based in reality. That's why it's called a social construct. And so when you start having questions, when I start asking questions for people that really want to cling to this racial belief system, you can just start seeing things go off in their heads like, well, something's unsettling about that. Just the question in itself, because now I have to think differently about this thing that I'm calling myself. If I'm black, if I'm white, what does that mean? Is it real? Is it genetically based? Where do white people come from? Where do black people come from? You start breaking it down in levels, the logic of race starts to falter, because the race needs your just unquestioning belief. Mm-hmm. Don't think about it. Just believe in it and act accordingly. That's all it needs. That's all it wants.
Good. Hey, well, good. So when we come back, now we're going to start from that point right there when we talk about some of the terms. The first terms that we'll cover, we'll talk about black and white. We're going to do that right after this commercial break. Here on Talk About Unity today, we're talking about the language that divides us, and we'll be right back after this.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0, ignition, liftoff.
Don't push me because I'm close to the edge.
I'm trying not to lose my head.
Hey, this is the Talk About Unity show where I bring the talk.
And I bring the unity.
And together we talk about unity. Unity is what matters. Come on. And right now in our country, that's what we've got to do. So we do that here at Talk About Unity on the Edge Radio Network. Be with us every week.
It's going to be awesome. It always is. And I tell you what, the more we seek first to understand, then be understood, we make progress.
And we like to do that. And that's why everybody's on the brink. We love what we do at Edge Radio because everybody's on the edge. We bring them back from the edge and we bring the unity. So we're just glad to Edge Radio Network every Tuesday morning, 10 a.m. Talk About Unity, because here at Edge Radio Network, truth still matters. And we're back here on Edge Radio's Talk About Unity, and we've got a great one today. We're going to talk about the language that divides us. We've got our race deconstructionist George Middleton in the house out of Indianapolis, Indiana, And we're ready to begin talking about this terminology. And so, super producer Vince, if you go ahead and put up those terms on the screen, because we're going to start with an obvious one. We talked about critical race theory and how we got here. And every ideology needs a jargon to go along with it. And the jargon that we're going to talk about today is the language that is used to support all of these concepts of race. And the first one we start out with is this idea, and George covered that before we went to break. He talked about anything rooted in race ideology. And so we start out with these terms white and black. And you know, one of the things that's so crazy about that is when you look at the census form, they have white, black, then they have everybody else's ethnicity, and it's like, what's that about? So how do we get to this white, black, and what do we do about the white, black, George?
Again, the process first has to begin with the individual focusing on himself. The white, black on the form means nothing if the person who's looking at the form says, well, that isn't me. I have nothing to do with that. And it's going to take that ability for individuals to be self-reflective and then have the courage to say that that's no longer the way that I'm going to operate in my life because it doesn't align with my values. Now, there are some people who, when they are faced with the reality of what race ideology stands for, they're going to probably say, yeah, I like what race stands for. It's working for me, so I'm going to go ahead and do that. Well, that's at least it's done on a conscious level. But for the average person, most people want to do the right thing. They just don't know how. And I submit to you that this presentation, a formula I'm giving you is that how to deconstruct race as it concerns you. So start with the individual level. And make an honest assessment of yourself, and then making a conscious commitment one way or the other, but pick a side. You can't be both. You can't be both color and culture. They're two different things.
And how is that met with resistance by people today, or are they willing to do that? Are they willing? And do you think, and when they're not willing, is it because they don't understand it, or they're just so clinging to their white, black paradigm?
Well, no one is speaking this way other than me and you, Carlin.
Right.
So I know that when I am giving my presentations, it depends on the person's mindset. First of all, as human beings, change is not the most inviting aspect of our experience. We like things to be predictable, comfortable, and repetitive, right? So now here I come. And here you come talking about, well, this race thing, really, we need to reevaluate that. And that is the person's identity for the most part. So there are, a few different kinds of mindsets. There's a fixed mindset and there's the flexible mindset. And then there's the kind of mindset that's kind of on both sides of the fence. So you're going to get a range of those type of responses from just straight out, I don't want to hear it. I don't say anymore. I don't want to know about it. To, hey, well, that's interesting. Tell me more. What do you mean by that? And so it's such a identity is such a personal journey. And you have to respect that person's response, whatever it is, you have to respect it because I understand that it's coming from the essence of who they are. Someone told them that they were this lunacy ideology, that they're this skin color. And they were told that from birth. So they've had years to practice this identity. Not everybody's going to be so flexible in entertaining the fact that maybe it's not real.
Great. All right, we're talking about the language that divides us, and let's look at some of the other terms. We talked about critical race theory early. We talked about this idea that was brought in. Of course, it ushered in a new era of race ideology, and we're talking about how that has inevitably been the thing that has divided us, and that continues to happen. What about this term anti-racism? Anti-racism is a new term that has come about recently. How is that a word that divides us?
It does for me. Again, this is just my professional opinion, but for me, it validates the very thing you're trying to invalidate. So
it validates what you're trying to invalidate. Okay, that's good.
Yeah. So let's be anti-racist. Let's be anti-racism. So it makes you focus on what you don't want rather than focus on what you do want.
Mm-hmm.
I don't want to be anti anything. I just want to be in a forward movement. I want to be pro this, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now that doesn't mean to not acknowledge what's in front of you. But when I put my strategy together, it's going to have more of what I want to do and where I want to be, more than what I don't like, what I'm fighting. Because now I'm giving my energy to the fight rather than to the movement of the direction I want to go to.
Yeah, that's like me.
So,
I teach young people, youngsters. I said, hey, I do character. I teach character. So it's like I would walk around saying, hey, I'm the anti-bad character guy. I'm the anti-bad character. I'm anti-bad character. I can't spend my time being anti-bad character. I teach character. It's cray.
We will go in the direction of our focus.
Yeah.
Bottom line, we will go in the
That's-
direction of our focus, and
well said.
if we point them in this direction instead of talking about where we don't want to go, it's the whole premise of don't think about pink elephants. What's the first thing you're doing?
Yeah. But that's the thing. So the book was out, and you know this, George. Ibram X. Kendi wrote this book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, and the new line, the new narrative is it's not enough not to be racist. You have to be anti-racist. And
anti-racist.
So, that's one of those terms that then ultimately has caused a fracture, because people who I thought if I was just a good person and I treated everybody fairly, that I was doing well. Oh no, that's not enough. You have to be anti this other thing. So that's crazy. Now let's talk about some of the other terms that are out there. Here's one for you. White privilege.
Oh boy.
White privilege. What is that saying, George? What is white privilege?
That's a really, really loaded term, white privilege. And I don't confirm or deny its existence. I just ask questions as to what people mean by white privilege.
That's that therapist coming out. I just ask questions and try to make you think, and you got them thinking, George. Go.
Yeah. Because again, when we're talking racial terminology, everybody is coming from their own individual understanding and not from a standardized terminology. So if we were to try and give the official definition of white privilege, that would be a discussion in futility, because it's going to go against 90% of the people who believe in the concept of white privilege with their own definition. So I just rather have the conversation of what does white privilege mean to you, and then I can better tailor my discussion, my role in the discussion based on where that person's coming from, because everybody's coming from different perspectives about white privilege. However, objectively speaking, in race ideology is an ideology based on white supremacy. And when I use the word white supremacy, I don't mean it in a disparaging or anti way. It's just about the hierarchy. The hierarchy means that in the hierarchy of color, white is supreme, meaning it is on top and it is in control. It is the standard. Everything non-white is below that. So that's what white supremacy is. I was going to
say, George,
concept,
go ahead, George.
Yes. In that concept, that is where this notion of white privilege comes from. So there is room to discuss that objectively.
And so that's an issue, because when you lay that out, and that's the thing, you're defining terms, and as a cognitive behavioral therapist, I guess that's what you have to do to ensure that we're talking apples and apples. But the question is, in our society, which is one of our challenges I have in E.R.A.S.E, is how do we get people to have that discussion? Because most of these terms that we're talking about set people apart from each other at variance, and they never come together to have this discussion so that we can even define the term, so that I know what you're talking about. Okay, I understand what you're saying about white privilege, because white privilege only exists because of race, because it created the hierarchy, and the hierarchy says that whites are at the top, blacks are at the bottom, and that's a problem, because most people feel like, well, even if you give them those truths, then they want to go with their old paradigm, and say, okay, those things might be true. So they ignore the truth that you've just spoken to them about the racial hierarchy that exists, that we know exists, and the ideology, but saying, yeah, but there's still this other thing. And so we got a lot of conflict there. And it's that word you always use, Job, those words, cognitive dissonance. I mean, these people hear these truths, but they fight them. And so,
well, you asked the question how, and that's the most important aspect of it. When I'm having these discussions, the foundation of the discussion is I'm going to respect whatever your view is. That's not saying I'm going to agree with whatever your view is, and nor do I expect you to agree with any of my views. We're just having a discussion, and what I know I'll do is I'm going to respect your view.
That's good.
And it's in that respect that more information can be conveyed both ways, because I'm always learning. Even though I consider myself the subject matter expert in racial deconstruction, I'm not a subject matter expert as to how you are thinking. You are the subject matter expert as to how you're thinking. So for me to be effective, I need to listen to how you think. So your disagreement is going to tell me a lot on how you think. But here's the thing: even if we're not agreeing, it's still a productive discussion if we're sitting and having it respectfully back and forth, even in disagreement, because it's the passing of information that once it enters into your sphere of consciousness, it can't be deleted. Okay, so and there's times when I've had discussions and I just didn't see it, and then 2 or 3 days later, boom, it hit me, and I finally realized it. So we just have to have the discussion without this predetermined requirement that, okay, after it's over, you make sure that you agree with me. Because once you're on that type of mission with people, your discussion is going to be frustrating.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's our local race deconstructionist, George Middleton there, espousing those great the ideology that everybody needs to understand where we are as it pertains to race ideology. And so we're talking about the language that divides us. When we come back, I'm going to have Richard pick out some words that he just throws out there at George and gets George spin on them quickly, because we want to move through this because we got some other things to cover. And I think George has set a very good basis for how we need to begin dialoguing with each other, because that's what he's talking about, the way that he communicates with people. And that's what I think we need to probably package there, George. The thing that you talked about, how you're going to deal with people out of sense of respect, because there's not much of that going around. So we're going to do that when we come back on this after our break on Talk About Unity.
Hey y'all, I'm Robin B.
And I'm Dr. Kiva.
And we just want to know
how you living?
Join us every Monday
at noon Central Standard Time
here on E.R.A.S.E Radio TV. Take care.
When people stop talking to each other, society is on the edge. Let's bring them back. Edge Radio, because truth still matters.
Welcome back to Talk About Unity. And George Middleton's with us. George, I have some words on this list in the language that divises. One of the terms that I really want to talk about for a few minutes and help me out with this is the term social justice. I see it all over the map, all over the board, and it means so many different things to many different people. Can you speak to this word, social justice? And is it helping? Is it hurting? What do we do in talking about this word, social justice, to make things better?
Yeah, social justice is another word that is vulnerable to the filter of race. Somehow social injustice, that there's no inherently racial terminology within that, but social justice has gotten really hijacked with the ride of race. So, I mean, on its face, social justice shouldn't be a triggering word. But it's gotten linked in with the injustice, real and perceived, that is pretty much associated with race. The Derek Chauvin cases, the Breonna Taylor, these are the pictures, the visionary facades for social justice. So unfortunately, everything's trained to that. Even when you talking about diversity and inclusion, you go to a diversity and inclusion training, you don't really talk about diversity and inclusion as much as you talk about race. So everything seems to just get overwhelmed by this concept of race.
Yeah, the comments that were made by politicians and celebrities and just people in the media, if this trial does not turn out the way that I think it should, then I'm requesting or demanding that that there's blood in the streets, fire in the streets, stores get tore up, towns get tore up, because the one quote was, "They need to hear us, they need to feel us," and that does not seem to be making anything better. I mean, is this unrest? I get it. This letting your voice be heard, I get it. But how is tearing up towns and all this making things better? That's question one. Question two: what's the alternative to that? You know, there needs to be justice, and the voices need to be heard, and they need to feel the pressure of the entire community to rule right in this situation. But what's the alternative to tearing up the city to bring about social justice? What are some of those better alternatives that you could think of?
Great question, but we just got to make sure that we're framing that question in the correct context.
Sure.
We're dealing with a context of trauma, and you cannot. It's not realistic. I mean, it's desirable, but not very realistic to expect sane or reasoned behavior from a traumatized person or a group of traumatized individuals.
Sure.
So we have to really recognize that trauma is at the forefront of racism, of race ideology. Race ideology is an ideology of trauma, generational, historically documented trauma of lynchings, beatings, rapes, enslavement. I mean, it's all torture and trauma. And then we're trying to talk about it in 2021 as this kind of nice, socially palatable, dinner discussion, when it's really a really ugly, hideous ideology.
Well, how do some people George? So how would people like you, and I would say, and me, how have we escaped the trauma?
You have not. Mm-hmm. You just handle it differently. We all have different coping skills. Mm-hmm. But you have not. You just because we can all present these wonderful outer veneers of success and we got it together. But on any level, you pick it. On some level, each one of us have to negotiate with race ideology, either through anger or through repression, and for the smaller few, through direct, outright challenging and confrontation, not in an angry way, not in a fearful way, but in an objective way, challenging this ideology and trying to make sense out of it, which I would consider us three doing right now. We're trying to look at it in a reasoned manner and address it and figure out the effective route to it. But we're all affected.
That's right.
We all are affected, no matter what.
Yeah,
so that's one of the.
Yeah, so we're all affected by race ideology. But are you saying race ideology is the trauma? Is that what you're saying? Because I was thinking about the trauma. Because there's a trauma that I think, because I hear people talk about this all the time, and they talk about 400 years this and whatever, and they talk about the trauma, and I go, all right. So is that the same thing as race ideology?
It's all trauma. So there's this perception that the only people going through trauma are those who identify as Black, and in reality, it's not true. Those who identify as white go through trauma as well, but it's demonstrating differently. And through research, one of the chief ways that trauma of race is impacting the white identity is depression and suicide, because there's a lot of guilt associated with being that racial identity that often goes unnoticed. Because people will look at white and say, oh, there's no problem. Life is good for them. There are stressors associated with the white identity that really can bear a lot more discussion.
Yeah, that's really good. I heard Isabel Wilkerson talk about that in her book Caste, where she talked about that, and she talked about the staggering numbers of middle-aged white suicides, and they began to look at that, and they had their reasons why they thought that was, and so. But yeah, George, I think I don't have any trauma though, man. But all right, all right, cool. All right, let's move. All right, you got another word? Give him another word.
Okay, there's this word that it's actually half of a word that gets tied to 1,000 other words, and that's the word phobic. Everybody's putting phobic behind everything. Phobic meaning, correct me if I'm wrong, the fear of, and so everything's phobic right now. How is this a word that, I can think of a few, but phobic being tied to the end of several words is really dividing us.
And it's what's driving our country, unfortunately. And there are people that master the use of phobia. It's emotion. It's emotion based. And emotion is very addictive. And when you feel hopeless and helpless, emotion is that drug that you need. So whether it's in a protest, it's in violence, as long as there's some emotional gratification, the emotion feels like the solution, right? I went there and I expressed myself and I told them this, or I tore this up, or I blew that up, or I charged the Capitol building. It felt like a solution. But at the end of the day, when the dust clears, you're looking for your next fix because you realize that you didn't really change anything.
Yeah.
And now you're looking for the next anger. So you're in a constant state of phobia. You're in a constant state of fear. And you're looking for ways to eradicate that fear. And emotion is the most easily available stressor release that you can find. But the more challenging way is to use your brain and use critical thinking to address the situation.
Yeah. And am I wrong? But in order to get past the phobia, you have to face it. You have to face that fear. So whether it's homophobic or Trumpophobic or what would be some of the other phobics that we're looking at? There's so many other phobias. Why can't people that are different than someone else that they have just had reservations with get to where we're having this conversation? There needs to be more forums. There need to be more community opportunities for people to be able to just ask questions like we're asking today, and just be able to speak through and say, when you say this word, like these words that divide us, this is the emotions that it solicits inside of me, and just to understand that my response is totally different than yours. I think it's kind of like the boogeyman in the closet. Once you turn the light on, you realize it's just a pair of shoulder pads and a helmet. It's real. Right. There's no power there. There's no fuel there. It's just something that is fixated in your mind, and we need to get better.
Well, in answer to your question, the discussion format, as great as it is starting to lose its flavor because there's no meat at the end of that bone. Discussion that does not lead to action, that does not lead to solution, again, is only a short-term gratification piece. You have to have the discussion that leads towards tasks of objective and goals. Tasks of objectives and goals.
That's good.
So just like in work, when you have a staff meeting, you never leave that you never close the staff meeting down without task items for each individual to do before the next staff meeting. And these type of discussions have to be anchored to some objectives and tasks so that when you leave the discussion, you now have some work to do. You're actively working. What we do is, I went to this great discussion. Well, what came out of it? Well, it was just a really good talk. It's like, I went to church. What are you talking about? Well, I don't know, but it was just the church service was really good, right? There's got to be some work that comes from it. Otherwise, it was just an emotional experience.
Call to action.
That's great, George. And I think that's the thing. When George and I hit the road, that's the kind of stuff that we're going to do. We're going to set up people because through our relationship, George has shown me how to talk. Because there's a lot to that. And I call it the art of dialogue. And we're going to create that so that people can have meaningful conversations that do lead to changed behavior and things like that. So that's what we're working on with George Middleton, and we'll be making that happen. All right, so we're going to take a break here. When we come back, we're going to move on, and we're going to talk about the fact, because we just talked about the language that divides us. We're going to talk about some of the consequences we're seeing in our society out there because of this language and how we'll need to address those. So we'll do that when we come back here on Talk About Unity.
The Natural Nation Network is really about taking control of your health physically, spiritually, emotionally, even intellectually, because there's so much out there in misinformation. There's a lot of people now that are suffering from all sorts of diseases that they really wouldn't have to suffer for if they had better information. And that's what we're here to do. Provide information that can save lives.
The mind and the body are totally connected.
Health can be really serious, and sometimes we just have to lighten it up a little bit while we're still providing substantive information.
And my sort of mantra on the salsa dance floor is kind of similar. I tell somebody, if you make a mistake twice, it becomes a move. Okay,
Tune into Natural Nation every Tuesday at 11 a.m.
Edge Radio TV is holding auditions for new show hosts. Are you a subject matter expert, professional, influencer, book author, thought leader, or business owner with an educational or motivational platform? Then we want to meet you. Send a link of some of your work to edgeradio20@gmail.com and be sure to put audition in the subject line. Join the Edge Radio TV family. Edge TV, because truth still matters.
Hey, well, welcome back to Talk About Unity, where we can only talk about unity if we talk about what divides us. And today our topic was the language that divides us. We have our resident racial deconstructionist, George Middleton, in the house. And so we're back, and we're going with part 2 of our show. We talked about the language that divides us, but you keep hearing this term in public now talking about how words have consequences. And so I'm going to cover a few of those things, and we're going to talk about them. The research, where I got this information was from Christopher Rufo. He runs this place called Battleground. It's a public policy research center, and he goes out as an investigative journalist, and he goes into these corporations and he asks the questions, and he does surveys on these organizations. And so we got some interesting things, and so I want to cover some of the things that he's found there. So if we could go ahead and start with the government JPEG there, Vince, our super producer. Look at this, and these are some of the things that he's found in some of his research, that this is the kind of stuff that's happening. And he says he's got like thousands of cases of these things happening. In this particular one, this was in the government, the Treasury Department, Department of Homeland Security, and the FBI. These are the things he's found. He said they had this idea in Treasury Department. They told them virtually all white people contribute to racism. One that they found in the Department of Homeland Security says they were telling white employees that they have been socialized into oppressor roles. And so that was some of the terms that we talked about: oppressor and oppressed and oppressor. And so those are some of the terms that come out of critical race theory. So this is what the training that they're getting. And then in the FBI, they're holding workshops on intersectionality. All of these are terms and jargon that come out of that idea of critical race theory. And here's another one. If we go to public schools, if you go to the next one, Vince, the public schools, public education graphic there. In the public education, then this is some of the stuff that's happening in schools. Now, you're talking about first graders, all right? It's just
in California. So make sure you get that right.
This is California, but we've got one in Missouri, and I tell you what, my wife does school law. We've got some of these cases in Texas, and so it's these are some of the ideas that are out there. But in California, first graders were told to rank themselves according to their power/privilege. First graders are getting this idea that some people are privileged and some people have this power. And so that's that. I mean, I'm not gonna say demonic, but that's you. I mean, you're indoctrinating first graders with this mentality. That's crazy. All right. Springfield, Missouri, in the middle school, they created an oppression matrix and asked students to see where they were. And one of the things that's not on the slide that they talked about, they identified on the oppression matrix that if you were a straight white male, then you were on the oppression end of the matrix. And then when as you went to the other end of the matrix, and it was
the victim.
Yeah, the people of color and the non-males and things like that. So it's just that's public education. All right. The last one is just this one, Sandia National Laboratories, and what they do is they do a lot of research on the nuclear arsenal, nuclear weapons, and things like that. Here's what they did: they had a 3-day re-education camp where they were told that white male culture was analogous to the KKK and white supremacists. And so, Richard, just the fact that you're a part of white male culture says you got some deep-rooted KKK, white supremacy stuff inside of you. And then, if that wasn't enough, they were told that they needed to renounce their white privilege, and they had to send fictitious letters to women and people of color.
This is part of the hug tour, right? We got a hug and apology tour.
Oh, my goodness.
I'm so sorry I did this to you. I didn't do anything. Maybe great grandpa or somebody did that.
Yeah, but that's not what they say. They say that you got it by the fact that basically because of your skin color, you got it.
Skin color.
You got it. Now, you remember I argued when my brother was on the show here. I argued with him one day, and he said he thought I was extreme for saying that this stuff happened. He said, "Nah, you can't prove to me any of this stuff happened."
There it is.
So every time I get one of these things, I send them to him, and he goes, "Yeah," and he's like not feeling it. But I'm going, you got a different view of the world and what's actually going on out there. So, George, how much is this stuff? And this is George's area. Is this stuff actually happening out there? And what do we do? What are we doing about it?
Well, go back to your first slide.
Okay, go back to the government one there, Vince. The one, the government. Yeah, there we go.
Yeah, so that one sets the template for ineffective communication. If I had put that slide together, I would have used words very differently. I would have stated virtually all people who identify as white and all people who identify as black contribute to racism.
Whoa, boom. That's big, George. That's big. All right. So, George, you're educating. All right. You're educating because everything that George said there goes with the premise of our show and what George said in the beginning of the show, that if you subscribe to race ideology, you contribute. Now, people that are dark skinned, such as me, George, will say, no, you're trying to say I'm part of the blame.
Right. Because in the black identity, that's the role of the black identity. The role of the black identity, it was designed by the European to be that victim. It was never designed to be equal. It was never designed to be supreme. It was designed specifically. That's the ideology. We're not talking about how you might really feel. We're talking about the ideology. And once you take on a label from that ideology, all of the beliefs that go with that, guys, come with that. So you might be a nice God-fearing man, Christian guy, love everybody, go to, volunteer your time. But if you have a racial identity, black or white, you have willingly accepted all of the stuff that comes with being white or being black. You can't have it both ways. You can't say, well, I'm white, but I'm not all that bad stuff. That's just the reality. If you take a racial identity, black or white, then you're taking the belief system. So that's how I would have reworded that. Because the way he worded it is a racially based paradigm, which is white people bad, white people very, very bad. That's not effective, and it gets the type of response like, well, my people didn't do it, and I'm not doing it, so why am I being made to feel a racist? And that's not the objective At least when I'm doing racial deconstruction, that's not my objective. My objective is for you to look at it in an objective manner and make effective decisions.
This is a T-shirt. This is a T-shirt. Virtually all people who identify as white or identify as black contribute to racism.
Yeah.
That's the whole answer, is to realize it's who you identify as. So
okay. And so, all right. And so here's the thing, because George, you just laid it out right there, and I think that's the key thing, that it's almost like a play. And if this were a play, then people have assigned roles. Mm-hmm. You're in this role, you're in that role. They all contribute to the play and what's being presented there. And so it's as bad for, while we think white people are on top in their role as at the top of the hierarchy, we're saying it's just as bad that you take your role down here at the bottom, because you keep in place the structure. And so the fact that you're down here at the bottom, you're just filling the role in the play, and we got to stop the whole play. Okay? So, all right. And so, hey, well, that's great. And we looks like we've lost George, but that's
George, go.
George. Okay. But hey, but it's cool because he dropped the bomb, and that's what we're going to finish the show with, talking about that. Because that's it. I mean, I think he laid the framework for saying it's just the ideology. And everybody that subscribes to race, you're part of the problem. Now, people are going to be upset with us about that, but hey, let's get over it and let's move on and let's fix this thing, because I don't think a lot of people want to resolve this.
I mean, look, we have to sit on that for just a second if we can, because go back to that last slide real quick. Virtually all white people contribute to racism. No, virtually all people who identify as white and all people who identify as black contribute to racism. And when we get that,
they're going to stone you for that. They're going to stone you and George.
We get rid of the white villain and the black victim. The villains and the victims all go away when we put everybody in the same pot. Come on, we can all be a villain. We can all be a victim. We really can. I mean, really, we need to get out of this paradigm of really those labels.
I think he's screaming erase race. He's screaming erase race. And we understand that people have a hard time with it, but I think George Middleton, cognitive behavioral therapist, will hit them cognitively so that people can begin understanding that. And I think that's what's so important, and we've got to do that. And so give us some closing words before we go out here for the show. This is a great show. We thank you, George, for all the input, and we're going to build on that stuff. George, we're going to go out there. I'm going to grab you in Indianapolis, and we're going to tour the country, and we're going to deconstruct this thing called race.
A mini plan of action from today is the language that divides us. Let's talk about the language that unites us, which is the language of love and kindness. And so I would just encourage you, stop showing your ugly teeth, start showing your pretty teeth. Like, it's time to smile at people. I don't care who they look like or what's the look on their face. Open up a door for somebody. Smile at somebody. Tell them hello. If they give you something or do something for you, tell them thank you. Tell them please. Manners does not need to go out of style. It needs to be the thing that catches on. We can have better manners and treat people well. And it's the law of sowing and reaping. Let me finish. I'm a pastor. Do not be deceived. Galatians 6:7. Do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, he will reap. So let's sow some good stuff.
Thank you. This is Edge Radio Network's Erase Race Talk About Unity. We want to thank you all for being a guest, for being here this week. We got our guest, George Middleton, and we'll catch you all next time on Talk About Unity.